Hey, Steve.
Hello.
Or hello, everyone.
And go here. Okay, so what we want to do today is finish up Hume's inquiry of human understanding. And we had gotten through the big part of it last time, which is we had gotten to Hume's problem of induction. So let's quickly just run through, right? Two species of philosophy, the easy and fun kind that normal people like, and the hard and interesting kind that the philosophers like. And you should follow the hard one, but realize that it's going to lead you to some weird places, still be a human being, right? Of the origin of ideas, remember Hume is an empiricist, right? That is, we're going to see the foundations of knowledge look very much like what we had with Locke, that we get our basic ideas through sense perception, right? That the senses give us these impressions, which we then create into lasting ideas, right? And they have to come in through the senses. But where Locke didn't give us everything is really what's interesting are not the ideas, but the propositions we have about the ideas, right? Green is nice, lemon is nice, but how much philosophy are you going to do going lemon, green? Not terribly interesting, especially since you need to wait for your lemon to ripen, apparently, right? The point is what we want are propositions. We need sentences because it's sentences that are true and false, and philosophy is about truth, right? So the only things that are true are propositions. So we need to take our ideas and somehow create propositions out of them. And for that, we need the mortar to stick the bricks together. We need the glue to stick the pieces together. And those are what he calls associations. And there are, he wants to say, three basic ones that every sentence in some way is reducible to, and they are resemblance, that is, two things are alike in some way or different in some way. Contiguity, that is, two things are connected or next to each other, and that could be next to in space or next to in time. And cause and effect, that one thing causes the other. And what he wants to say is every single sentence that we want to consider has ideas that came in through the senses, and those ideas are stuck together in some way, connected by these associations. They are, one might say, associated with each other, and they either are or aren't associated in that way. If they are associated in that way, the proposition's true. If they're not, the proposition is false. So he says we have two kinds of truth, right? Picking up this thread from Leibniz, we have relations of ideas, which give us two ideas in an association, and we can determine the truth or false of it simply by looking inside, by knowing the meanings of the terms, right? These are our logical truths. These are our a priori truths, truths that are knowable without experience. On the other hand, there are matters of fact. These are propositions whose denial is just as possible. With a relation of ideas, its negation, its denial is contradictory. With a matter of fact, its denial is still perfectly possible, right? So if I say it's raining, well, that's either true or false. Let's look, right? Because its negation, it's not raining, is also possible. So we have our two kinds of truth, right? We have two groups, the rationalists and the empiricists, looking for justifications for truth, right? Does it mean that everybody just gets something and we go about our merry way? This is Hume, of course not, right? So on the one hand, it is absolutely true that one of the two categories is justified exactly the way the rationalists say, right? And those are our relations of ideas. Those are justified by pure reason. And so the rationalists win that hand. Unfortunately for the rationalists, yeah, those are true sentences, but they're not true about anything. So while they certainly do claim victory in terms of this kind of knowledge, it's an empty victory because basically they're truths about nothing. On the other hand, we have matters of fact. Now, matters of fact can be divided into two different groups. There are those that are open to what Hume will call proofs, and that is something that we get from direct observation. And we'll draw this distinction between proofs and demonstrations. A demonstration is a logical argument, what we normally mean by the word proof. But what he means by proof is, oh, is the sky blue? Let me look. Yep, blue, right? So there are certain matters of fact that are justified exactly the way that the empiricists say, right? And those are ones that are accessible through direct observation, right? Proof in his terminology. However, while the rationalists get something vacuous, the empiricists get something trivial, there remain our most important propositions, the propositions of science. And these are all cause and effect propositions, right? That's what science is. Science is the study of cause and effect relations, right? What causes what and why? Hume says, well, how do you know the why? And here's where we get into our problem of induction. What justifies our belief in inductive propositions? Well, can't be direct observation, can't be deduction. There's only one thing left, induction. But if we try to use induction to justify induction, we end up with a circular argument that goes on and on. And so the idea here, he wants to say, is that we do believe in science. We can't not believe in science. We absolutely believe in science. Why? What's the justification? And the answer is, there isn't a justification. There is no good reason to believe in the truths of science. We just can't help but do it. Our minds are susceptible to custom, right? Our minds develop habits, and that is what justifies induction. It's just a habit of the mind, right? The idea is our mind, and any mind like ours, if we see something and then we see another thing, we see something, then we see that other thing, we see something, then we see that other thing. When we see the first thing, we expect the second one, not because we have good reason to believe it, but because that's just how we're wired. He gives us a psychological, not a logical explanation. And that's what takes us to our reading today, right? And so we hit section 6 of probability. And he starts with this distinction I had mentioned a minute ago, right? Demonstrations, and this is the term that Aristotle uses for deductive proofs, are deductive proofs. Proofs, on the other hand, aren't proofs. For Hume, a proof of something is the empirical observation of it. So, if we say grass is green and somebody says, prove it, you take them outside and you show them the grass. For Hume, right, as an empiricist, that's going to be what he means by proof. And then there's probabilities, right? What do we mean by probability? There's a 20% chance of rain today. If I roll this die, it's about 1 in 6 shot of getting a 6, right? What do we mean by probabilities? Or, is Gettysburg College going to exist in the fall? Probably. Well, what justifies probably, right? That's the question here. And that seems to be a promising angle to the resolution of the problem of induction. Maybe induction is really about probabilities. So let's talk about probabilities. And the first thing he does is distinguish between what we nowadays, this is modern terminology, this is not Hume's terminology, we call the distinction between metaphysical and epistemological probability. Right? The idea here is by a metaphysical probability, we mean actual accident or chance in the Aristotelian sense, right? That is that there is no fact of the matter about what is about to happen until it happens, right? The future, for example, is open. It could be this way. It could be that way. It isn't determined yet. That's different from an epistemological probability, right? So metaphysical probabilities say that the actual case is not determined by what came previous. We have to wait to see what reality turns out to be. Epistemological probability is where it's determined, we just don't know. We can't know which one it is, right? So let's, for example, take, the beginning of an American football game. It starts with a coin flip to see, who kicks the ball to whom, right? And the idea here is it's a coin. It's flipped. That is, pressure is exerted on the edge of a coin. It then rotates a certain number of times, goes to a certain height, continues rotating at a certain rate, is liable to certain, air currents, right? It then hits the ground. It bounces off of grass, which means it's going to get a certain bounce, maybe high enough to flip over one time, maybe not. But the point is that if we knew all of the variables exactly, we knew exactly the weighting and density of the coin, we knew exactly how much force, we knew exactly on what part of the coin the force was exerted, we knew the wind speed, right? If we knew all of that, we should be able to, using physics, accurately, completely predict whether that coin was going to be heads or tails. But the point is, while it might be a metaphysical certainty that it was going to come up tails, right? Captain Jones of the visiting team doesn't have all of the factors, doesn't have the accurate laws of physics, and doesn't have a college education in physics that would allow him to do the calculation quickly enough to determine, which one it was necessarily going to be. So while there was no metaphysical uncertainty, there was an epistemological uncertainty, right? The fact is there was a fact. We just couldn't have known that fact. And so while that was a metaphysical certainty, it was an epistemological uncertainty. And so Hume takes care to draw that distinction. And he wants to say there are no metaphysical probabilities. He says, though there's no such thing as chance in the world, our ignorance of the real cause of any event has the same influence on the understanding and begets a like species of belief or opinion, right? A like species. That is, it's not metaphysical probability, right? There is no such thing as chance. So he's denying that metaphysical probability exists, but there is a like species. That is, there is a similar case, and that's the epistemological one, right? So all of the probabilities we deal with are a result of our lack of knowledge. It's a result of our ignorance, not about the world itself being undetermined. This should strike you as slightly odd, because what is Hume arguing against everywhere? Metaphysics. And yet here he is buying, seemingly, Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason. I mean, it goes back to the Middle Ages before Leibniz. But the point is, this idea of the principle of sufficient reason and determinism seems present here in Hume, despite the fact that he's seemingly blowing up the rest of metaphysics. So Hume is more than happy to use metaphysics to destroy metaphysics. Just don't ask him to really buy into it. Now, this idea of probability seems like a really promising route to a solution to the problem of induction. And Hume is the first one in framing the problem of induction to suggest it as a possible way out. Of course, we'll see in a minute that he shoots it down. He thinks it won't work. But, and a couple of you guys asked about this last time, this actually is the line that lots and lots of thinkers have taken to try to solve the problem of induction. So Rudolf Carnap, Hans Reichenbach, two of the major players in logical positivism, formulate very sophisticated arguments about the nature of probability thinking that that will be an answer to the problem of induction, right? The idea here is we could call it the problem of deduction. How does logic work? And we had Bertrand Russell, right, come up with a formal structure that justifies the foundations of logic, right? That's what we do in our logic class, you know, with the truth tables and everything else, is we show from first definitions, what do we mean by and? What do we mean by not? What do we mean by if then? Okay, now we can show with absolute certainty that if these two propositions are true, then this other one has to be true, right? Now we can set up a system of proof so that we can prove any valid argument to be valid, right? And so we have a real strict definition or set of definitions and set of processes by which we can justify any deductive inference. The hope was maybe we could do the same thing with induction by setting up a mathematical theory of probability. And so we have axioms of probability, and we could see what truths of probability follow from the axioms. And now we could set up, and this goes into what we call Bayesianism, right? That is, we can use Bayes' theorem to talk about, well, if this is the prior probability of a hypothesis being true, that is the likelihood of it being true without the evidence, and this is the likelihood of the evidence being true, then this is going to be the likelihood of the hypothesis being true given the evidence. And if the hypothesis is more likely to be true given the truth of the evidence than it would be without, then the evidence seems to be good reason to believe. And so the idea of coming up with a formal mathematical structural, in essence, deductive account of probability and using that as a foundation for inductive reasoning, that was one hope to be able to circumvent Hume's problem. Now, Hume doesn't think it's going to work, and here's why. He says, this concurrence of several views in one particular event begets immediately, by an inexplicable contrivance of nature, the sentiment of belief, and gives that event the advantage over its antagonist, which is supported by a smaller number of views and recurs less frequently to the mind. So remember, before this, he's talking about rolling a die, right? Remember, Hume is a gambler, right? He waxes poetic in various places about the difference between playing poker with his upper class rich friends and playing poker with his poor friends back in Edinburgh, and how much more fun poker was with the old gang, right? So he's a card player, he's a dice player, right? He's a billiard player, right? This guy gambles. And if you gamble, you think about probability. And he says, consider a die, right? And let's say instead of the usual die where we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 on the various sides, let's just say we put 1 on 2 sides and 2 on 4 sides. Now, which one is more likely to come up? Well, when you roll the die, metaphysically, it's already determined what's going to happen. There is no metaphysical probability, but there is an epistemological one. And you think, well, wait a minute, there are twice as many sides marked 2 as there are marked 1, so it's more likely going to come up 2. Likely. But there is no likely in the world, right? This concurrence of several views, right? So when the die rolls, you picture each of the possible circumstances happening. You picture it coming up with the 1 side of 1. You picture it coming up with the second 1. You picture it coming up with the first 2, the second 2, the third 2, the fourth 2. You picture all of these possibilities in your mind, right? And the concurrence of several views, right? That is, you have all together in your mind all of these different possibilities of one particular event, the rolling of the die, begets immediately by an inexplicable contrivance of nature, the sentiment of belief. So the belief pops in your head. You do believe it, right? And it gives that event the advantage over its antagonist, the rolling of the 2 rather than the 1, which is supported by a smaller number of views and recurs less frequently to the mind. That is, you have fewer pictures in your head of it coming up 1 because there are more 2s on the die. If we allow that belief is nothing but a firmer and stronger conception of an object than what attends the mere fictions of the imagination, this operation may, perhaps in some measure, be accounted for. That is, notice where he's going. He's going with probability exactly to the same place he went when he was dealing with cause and effect. It's a psychological explanation as to why the mind has this belief, not a logical justification for why we should have the belief. The concurrence of these several views or glimpses imprints the idea more strongly on the imagination, gives it superior force and vigor, renders its influence on the passions and affections more sensible, and, in a word, begets that reliance or security which constitutes the nature of belief and opinion. So the idea here is when he's shooting crap, right, and he's hoping that it comes up 7, right, it's just a hope. He can imagine every possible circumstance which could be the case. Now, there's only one that is the case, and that is predetermined. There is no chance. But the reason we have probability is it's just a function of the way our minds are structured, not a function of the way the world is structured. There is no chance. It's going to come up what it's going to come up. It's just that we don't know. And so what the mind does is it pictures all the possibilities, and there are just more in one group than there are in the other group. And since there are more of them, the mind latches onto it, and therefore, that's why we believe. Okay. So if there is no real probability, then what we're saying is everything is necessary. Everything has to happen. That's what he said, right? There is no chance. So what we should believe is not the existence of probability. We should believe in the idea of a necessary connection. That's really the foundation of the metaphysics of the universe, right? It isn't probability. We just ruled out probability. And if it isn't probability, it has to be necessity. So we should be able to then clearly understand the idea of a necessary connection between two events, right? Euclid, he says, does give us deductive certainty, right? And here's where he goes into that wonderful extended passage saying how amazing Euclid is, right? Euclid does provide, exactly as the rationalists adore so deeply, this incredible template for absolute certain knowledge, right? All of the results of geometry are true, fixed, and eternal. It's fantastic. Wouldn't it be great if everything, just like the rationalists want, could be the result of Euclidean type demonstrations? Yeah, but the difference he wants to say is Euclid has an advantage because there aren't real triangles, because there aren't real circles, because these are just ideal entities. What he gets to do is start with absolute definitions, axioms, and postulates. Because they are, in a sense, imaginary things, we can come up with absolute rules that govern them. But when we're dealing with real things in the real world, when we're dealing with actual metaphysics or ethics, we don't have definitions of that clarity, right? And notice the word he uses there, clarity, right? It's clearly a dig at Descartes, who wants to say that from God we get these clear and distinct ideas, and we can have absolute firm belief in the foundations of metaphysics and ethics. Why? Because it's underwritten by the non-deception of God, and it has to be because it's a clear and distinct idea. And he's saying that there are no clear ideas apart from those of mathematics. He says, let's look at a few of these notions that should be the sorts of clear ideas we have that undersit metaphysics or ethics. Force, energy, power, necessary connection, right? And what's he going to do? Well, let's do it exactly the way we did cause and effect, right? If I say A forces B to do this. Or A has a certain energy, which results in this. Or A has power to do. Now notice force, energy, and power. These are all words we use in physics, right? But they're also words that you will find used in epistemology, right? Especially the word power, for example, right, is all over Locke, right? Remember, the idea behind secondary qualities is that objects have powers. They have the power to put certain ideas in your mind that they don't themselves actually contain, right? So the lemon isn't yellow. The lemon just has the power, according to Locke, to create the idea of yellow within your mind. And so these ideas of force, energy, power, and necessary connection are certainly deeply embedded in science, but they're also deeply embedded in the larger epistemological project, right? Necessary connection is what rationalism is all about. This notion of power is clearly what Lockean empiricism is all about. And yet, if we want to be good empiricists, do we ever see these? No, they're like the causal nexus, right? They are also invisible powers, right? We observe A and we observe B, right? But do we ever observe the necessary connection between A and B, the power of A and B, the force of A applied to B? No, we don't, right? You may see the bat hit the ball and you may see the ball fly off. That's A and B. But do you ever see the necessity of the ball going? Do you ever see the force, the power? No. So we may use these words all the time in science and in philosophy, but do they have any meaning? Are they ever directly observed? And the answer is no. And Hume says, well, okay, well, wait a minute. There seems to be one force that we might be able to observe, and that's the force of the will, right? That is, sometimes we choose to do things, right? And at this point, if we were actually in a classroom together, I would have somebody, we'd do the silly thing again. I'd have someone stand up. I'd have them raise their arms. I'd have them stand on one leg. I'd have them cluck as a chicken, right? And we'd see how far the person would be willing to take it, right? And the point is that, why did you do those things? Well, you told me to. Well, I told you to jump out the window. You didn't do that, right? Well, the idea is you did it because you chose to. And the fact is, you only stand up, raise your hand, stand on one foot, and cluck like a chicken in front of the class when you decide you want to. It doesn't just randomly happen. If it did, the classes would be much more interesting, right? The fact is, right, these things only happen when you decide to do it, when you want to do it. And so the idea is, maybe there is one sort of force that we do have direct observation about, right? The force of the will. I perceive myself desiring it, and I perceive my body doing it. So maybe that is one force that we do see. Well, here's what he says. The motion of our body follows upon the command of our will. Of this we are every moment conscious. But the means by which this is effected, the energy by which the will performs so extraordinary an operation, of this we are so far from being immediately conscious that it must forever escape our most diligent inquiry. Right? What is he playing with here? Think back to the problem with dualism, right? On the one hand, Hume seems to be a dualist, right? He's hard to pin down to any metaphysical view, but he certainly seems to be a dualist. At least, he will posit dualism in order to show you some of the problems with metaphysics. And the problem he's pointing here is what we called a couple of meetings ago, the problem of interaction, right? So let's say that the dualist is right. Let's say there is mind, and let's say there is body, and those are different kinds of things. How do they interact, right? And remember, we have interactions going in both directions. We have sensation, which is a physical interaction of the world with one of your sense organs, and then somehow it gives rise in the mind to an idea. right? This is where I kick the desk and, somehow by my toe rapidly contracting, the idea, ouch, pops in your head. Well, how does a merely physical interaction give rise to an idea? And on the other hand, we have volition, right? We have acts of the will, things that we choose, right? Again, have somebody write the word guacamole on the top of their page, right? Why did you do that? Because you chose to. Well, how is it that the idea, the desire to write this word, gets the hand, a physical object, to move? How can a mental event cause a physical event? And how can a physical event cause a mental event? How do they interact? And what Hume is saying here is that problem is insoluble. That problem cannot be solved, right? The motion of our body follows upon the command of our will, right? You only raise your hand when you want to. Your hand doesn't randomly just shoot up. Of this, we are every moment conscious, but the means by which this is affected, how it happens, the energy by which the will performs so extraordinary an operation. And notice that it isn't extraordinary. It's ordinary. It's what happens all the time. And yet, when we realize, oh my goodness, this is weird, it becomes extraordinary. Of this, we are so far from being immediately conscious. We do not see the interaction. We just know that we think it, the body does it. And it happens so often that it doesn't strike us as weird, but it's weird. And the fact is, we don't know how it works. It must forever escape our most diligent inquiry. There is no way that we will ever answer this question. So, we can't directly observe it, can't observe it in the world, can't even observe it in our own selves. He says the causes are in reality nothing but occasions, right? Again, the idea here is, remember, there are two very different associations, contiguity and cause and effect, right? We infer cause and effect. We see one thing, we see the other thing. We see one thing, we see the other thing. We see one thing, we see the other thing. And so we project a causal relationship amongst them. But he says, in reality, there's nothing but occasions. That is, there is nothing but contiguity. There's nothing but one coming after the other. Causes, necessary connections, forces. We have no access to these. We can't say they are. We can't say they're real. We have no access in any way empirically to forces or causes. We just know that every time I drop that stupid pen, it falls to the desk, right? Always happens. Been happening for 25 years. I'm going to keep doing it. It's going to keep happening. Why? We just know that it does, right? Now, you might say, well, Steve, what you've really been doing for these past 25 years is an ongoing scientific experiment in penology. Yeah, all right, I'll give you that. There's certainly a correlation. I have a whole lot of data when it comes to dropping pens on desks. But does that amount, Hume wants to say, to an epistemological hill of beans? Which is a really weird saying. I mean, I suppose a hill of beans would in fact be a hill of beans. So it really is a meaningless statement. But the point is that it's nothing, even if it is a hill of beans. But the point is that we might have this correlation. We have all this data. In order to get real science, we need to infer something about the cause, and there is no cause to be inferred to, right? We think we know it scientifically because we can write an equation on a board where all of our data corresponds to the equation. And yeah, okay, it does. So we can't get beyond it. Well, That's what happens when we have unsurprising events. Pens dropping to desks, and pens dropping to desks, and pens dropping to desks, and pens dropping to desks. When we have something that occurs over and over and over and over again, we think, okay, we have scientific knowledge about it. But what happens when something unusual happens? What happens when something surprising occurs? Well, now the mind is weirded out. Whoa, dude, why did that happen? The pen always falls. How come it went up to the ceiling this time? Right? So the idea here is when we have an unsurprising event, we just attribute by habit of mind some scientific explanation. But when we have something completely unexpected occur, we can't attribute a natural cause to it because the natural causes are the causes of science. And this has clearly violated the regularity. And so what we often do is we attribute it to a supernatural cause, right? So if something normal happens, science. If something abnormal happens, it must be an act of God, right? So the idea here is what happens? Well, we have a ready-made explanation, whether it's expected or not. Now, in this section, notice the example he uses. Billiard balls. Right? If this hits against that, that will go at a particular angle, at a particular speed, perfectly expected. What we see in this section in Hume is the birth of an example which will permeate all of philosophy afterwards. Anytime any philosopher wants to talk about a deterministic system, they will always go back to Hume's billiard ball metaphor. So when you wonder where that came from, why the quintessential example of things working the way they're supposed to be working comes from, it comes from this passage in Hume. And why in Hume? Well, in the last section, he was playing cards and dice. In this section, he's shooting pool. That's David Hume. So we have God, or don't. And the point is, we now have the fundamental problem that he seemed to presuppose an answer to a couple of sections ago, and that is free will versus determinism, right? One of the foundational problems in metaphysics is the question of free will and determinism. Are human actions freely chosen, or are they predetermined and necessary? Well, notice what Hume has just done in the previous sections. He's blown up the idea of probability, he's blown up the idea of necessary connection, and he's blown up the idea that we understand how our will moves our body. So he's blown up both of the notions, and now we have to frame the question of liberty and necessity. Are humans free, or are our actions predetermined? And what he says is, you're in trouble no matter which way you go, right? He says on the one hand, look, so he gives two arguments and he shows how each one reinforces the other. So if you're a determinist, you have to believe in free will. If you believe in free will, you have to believe in determinism. But free will and determinism are incompatible, so metaphysics just blows itself up. He says, look, all matter is governed by absolute laws of physics, right? How do material things behave? They behave in the way that the laws of physics tell us they have to. Thus, the material world is governed by necessity. Okay, that's fine. Descartes bought that, right? Descartes separated the world into, right, the material, which is governed by the laws of physics, then the mind, which has its own laws, right? And they could interact. But the notion of necessity is not observed and thereby not known, right? So the idea here is that we start with the material world being governed by necessity, but remember what we did in the last section, we don't actually know of necessary connections. It has to be added by the mind, right? The idea of necessary connection doesn't come from the world, it comes from our psychology. And we could choose to, or we could choose not to apply the notion of necessary connection to any two events we see. So therefore, anytime you're asserting that something is necessary, it's actually the result of a free choice made by a human mind. So necessity, a claim of necessity that this had to happen because that happened, right? When I dropped the pen, it had to fall. The only reason you believe the had to claim is because you chose to. So all necessity is an act of free will. But it goes in the other direction too. So while the material world is held to be deterministic, our actions are thought to be a matter of free choice, right? That is, sure, maybe the pen has to fall, but I can choose not to raise my hand. But we see the same choices based on the same passions in all times and all places. What he says is, let's look at human beings. Human beings are incredibly regular folks. If I come and flick you in the ear, you're going to get annoyed. If I stick my finger in your ear, you're going to say, stop it. And if I don't stop it, you're going to take your hand and knock my hand away. If I give you a servo chocolate chip cookie, thank you. You're going to be happy. And the idea is when you look at human actions and human emotions and human reactions, they're the same. They're the same over time. They're the same across the globe, right? We see people commit the same crimes for the same reasons. We see people do the nice things, the same regularity in the same situations. Humans are humans, right? So to say that the act was chosen because it's what I wanted, well, isn't it interesting that everyone else seems to make the same choice because they have the same wants? Because there are psychological and sociological commonalities, it seems like maybe we aren't really all that free. And notice what we're doing is we're going to observe regularities, and what can't our mind but do? Take those regularities and assert a rule, right? Cause and effect. And if we can do it with pens dropping, we can do it with students committing plagiarism. We can do it with students waiting for the last minute to turn in their papers, right? There are regularities. And if it's an inference from the regularities of pen behavior and a regularity with respect to student behavior, same inference. So if it's necessary in one case, it has to be necessary in the other. So when we look at how people, quote unquote, choose their actions, they do choose their actions, but they always seem to choose them in the same way. So liberty gives rise to necessity. So if you believe in determinism, it's the result of free will. And if you believe in free will, it's the result of determinism. So which is right? Let's just blow the whole thing up. He then takes it another step. He says, let's look at the minds of animals. Now remember, Descartes drew that distinction, right? That humans have minds, animals are mere automata, right? And this is something he was not unique in, right? Human beings are created in the image of God. We are unique in being this combination of mind and body. Why? Because our mind is a soul. And only human beings have souls. He says, we're empiricists. Let's take a look at animals. And he says, look, Animals perceive things, right? Animals see, right? They see, they smell, they taste. Okay. I mean, I can observe that in an animal just as much as I can observe it in an undergrad. And what else do we see in animals? They learn, right? That is, repeated perception leads to predictable action, right? You can train a dog, right? It learns what this means, and it learns to expect this outcome if it does this. It learns to expect this other outcome if it does that, and so it chooses to do that. But learning seems to imply belief, right? You can't learn unless you're learning something. And what is that something? It's a belief, right? The dog believes if it does this, it's going to get hit. It believes if it does that, it's going to get a treat or a pet on the head, right? Now, why do they form these beliefs? It could be because they understand Hume's notion of the mind and how cause and effect is a force of habit. Could be that animals fully understand the philosophy we're currently engaged in discussing. But it's not, right? He says animals are not genius enough to formulate this. But animals aren't alone in being that stupid. Children perceive, children learn, children can't understand philosophy. Common people, like children and animals, let's be honest, right? They perceive things. Some of them learn things. They're not genius enough to understand this. Most philosophers, right? It took Hume. And so what Hume is saying is if you look at every being in the world, except possibly for Hume, none of them really are smart enough. And so if humans have souls, then surely animals do as well. Because they're as smart and as stupid as we are. What does that mean? It means that animal minds aren't any different from human minds. And if animal minds aren't different from human minds, then humans aren't special. But humans were created in the image of God. Humans are special. No. Who is this going to annoy? The church. And if that's not enough, he then goes on to give his very famous argument against rational belief in miracles. All right? He's going to argue that there are never legitimate grounds for belief in the miraculous. Okay, what's the argument? He says this: natural occurrences follow the laws of nature, right? That is, I drop the pen, it falls to the desk. I drop the pen, it falls to the desk. There are laws of nature, and those are the rules by which the natural world behaves. What do we mean by a miracle? A miracle has to be a violation of one of these natural laws, right? When a miracle occurs, right, if that thing that we're saying is a miracle is just a result of a natural law, then it's not really a miracle. It's what was expected. It's normal. It's what was supposed to happen. So the miraculous must not just be weird. It has to actually be something that violates the laws of nature, right? Because if it's in accord with the laws of nature, then nature itself is the cause of it. If we want to say that the cause of this event is supernatural, then it can't be possible to explain it by the laws of nature. It has to violate the laws of nature. What does that mean? Well, it means that anyone who wants to declare any given act a miracle would have to have the true, complete laws of nature, right? Because if your understanding of the laws of nature is wrong or incomplete, then this thing could be explained by the laws of nature, Right? The only way you can be sure something is a miracle is if you are sure that it violated the laws of nature, which means you have to be sure about the laws of nature. So you have to have the actual complete laws of nature in order to say that anything is miraculous. But what do we know about science? Science progresses, right? That's just the nature of science, right? We have new theories disprove old theories. We have better theories. It's an ongoing process. And at any time, we probably have good principles, right? At this point, of course, we had Newton. This was before Einstein. Einstein, who really loved Hume, right? And so the idea here is that science progresses. At any given time, it's getting better and better. It's better than it was, but it's not as good as it will be. But what does that mean? That means that at any time, we never have the complete laws of nature. And if we don't have the complete laws of nature, we can't ever say that anything is a miracle. The best thing we could say is, well, look, our laws haven't been able to explain that yet. Will they? Well, that's an inductive inference. We can't make that claim either. And so the idea here then is that we have no reason to ever believe in the existence of miracles. And if we have no reason to believe in the existence of miracles, we have no reason to believe in the cause of the miraculous. We have no reason to believe in God. So, what has Hume done? Hume has undermined any rational belief in science. Hume has undermined any belief in religion. Hume has undermined any belief in the results of philosophy. Hume just blew up everything. That's the fun of Hume. Hume is the bad boy. Now, there was a very rigidly religious thinker in Königsberg, East Prussia, who read Hume, and his mind was blown. That thinker is Immanuel Kant. And it's to Kant we will turn Wednesday and Friday to end our discussions. So I will see everybody then.